Hi, I'm Amanda Jane Woodall and welcome to my fashion school. So today we're going to be talking about freedom, faith and fast love with the amazing George Michael. Yorgos Kyriakos Panagiotou was born on the 25th of June 1963 to a Greek Cypriot restaurateur and English dancer. He lived a comfortable middle-class upbringing in Hertfordshire after a move from London at 12 years old. And he realised he had musical ability at 14 whilst working at his parents' restaurant, as he realised he could write better melodies than he was hearing on the radio. He met his best friend Andrew Ridgeley on his very first day at Bushy Meads Comprehensive, when Andrew was appointed to look after the new George. And he was often very depressed at school, so he would play truant, he would jump on the buses and just ride on them all day to escape his life at school. And it was Andrew who had the first ideas of being in a pop group with George. And George also had the ambition to be a star, but he kept it a little bit quiet and he just pretended that he really wanted to study for his A-levels because he didn't want to disrupt his family life. And in 1981, they formed the band Wham! And they managed to get a record deal only 6 months after leaving school. They made a 4-minute demo tape and they gave it to a friend of a friend who was in the industry. And at this point, Yorgos, he changed his name to George Michael as he felt that this was more accessible to the fans. And they wanted to create something really upbeat, funky and new compared to the punk era that had been very about no future and being down and out. And Andrew was actually the inspiration for the style of the band at the beginning. And one of their first singles, Wham Rap, was about being unemployed, on the dole. And George actually had no experience of this because he'd come from a really comfortable upbringing. And the two bonded because they both had a really kind of naughty, silly sense of humour, and their first album was very tongue-in-cheek. And people didn't really understand that it was just their humour. They took what they said really seriously and they became the voice of the generation. And George started to realise that they really could make an impact on people, and their manager realised that they had massive potential on TV because they were both good looking and they had this kind of alluring style that was really popular with the fans. And the band just really was right for the era. George had always seen himself as a social climber, and Wham was kind of the antithesis of the yuppie movement and the antidote to the riots of the Thatcher years. And there was this expectation for young people in the 80s to have money, be prosperous and just have a lot of glamour and nice things in their life. And Wham just really played with this aesthetic. And George kind of liked the idea that he was making money without having to do anything horrible to make it. But there was a little shift in the band because at first George had been very ultra compliant with the record company, and he was saying, I'll do whatever you want, I'll be whatever you want me to be, just make me a pop star. But as he learned more about the industry, he started to realise that some of the executives just didn't know what they were doing, and he wanted to take the reins on the songwriting, and Andrew Ridgeley was just happy for him to do this because he knew that George needed this creative freedom. And this culminated with George releasing an absolute smash hit, which is Careless Whisper, in 1984. And it's very famous for its saxophone break, which George actually was responsible for writing. And he felt like the song was very precocious as he was just a teenager and he didn't really know anything about love or romance. And in 1986, the band decided to call it a day, so they held Wham! The final concert in Wembley in 1986, and it was completely sold out. And during the performance, George actually tore a ligament in his ankle, but he still carried on performing, and he even still went to the after party because this was the 80s and this was the hedonistic kind of party lifestyle that they were used to. And many people wondered why the band had ended at the very top of their success. But actually, this had always been the plan from the beginning. And Andrew Ridgeley, he left fame, he left the industry, and he went to have a very peaceful life in Cornwall. But George, he just kept on writing and performing, and he released his first solo album, Faith, the following year after the split. And this record was absolutely massive, in part due to his first release, I Want Your Ex. And this was seen as really a very raunchy and controversial song and video, and many radio stations refused to play it. But actually, the song was not about promiscuity. It was about love and passion within a relationship. And George even pointed out that one of the models in the video had the word monogamy written on them. And George was a really talented musician because he was able to sample different sounds and mix different genres to make really unique music. So he would mix kind of upbeat tempos and drum beats with folk guitar and rhythm and blues. And he also wanted to kind of deepen the meaning of his lyrics. So he started to look at poverty and the loss of religion in British society. And in 1992, he played the tribute concert to Freddie Mercury, who had passed away from AIDS in 1991. And he had a standout performance, singing the very difficult song Somebody to Love, and he was really praised and critically acclaimed for reaching the very high falsetto that Freddie had been famous for. And the concert was to raise funds for AIDS charities and kind of to release the stigma of AIDS within the gay community. And actually, George was suffering in his personal life with this issue because he had just recently got with his partner Anselmo Felipe, who was a Brazilian designer who had contracted the disease and died only 6 months into their relationship. And in 1996, he released an emotional tribute song to Anselmo, Jesus to a Child. And he had become very depressed at this point, and his lifestyle had become more turbulent, and he'd begun to take substances to cope. On April the 7th, 1988, George was arrested for performing a lewd act by an undercover police officer in California, Beverly Hills. And this led him to expose his sexuality as being a gay man on CNN. And he said he was not ashamed of who he was, but he just felt weak for the way he had got caught and exposed. And later on, he went to say that he felt that this act was actually a way of him being able to come out to his fans. He had felt so fraudulent in his career, and he just didn't have a very good way to come out as being gay. And George's style has developed throughout his career. So he was made famous by Wham!, this kind of bubblegum pop group with a very bright and pastel aesthetic, a kind of aesthetic that some people want to leave in the past and forget. He had the very typical 80s big fluffy mullet. He wore 2 gold hoop earrings and he wore tiny sports shorts. And he also kind of introduced these faddy trends like wearing visors and fluorescence. And a very iconic style moment was George in the Wake Me Up Before You Go video, wearing his white slogan t-shirt saying choose life, and this pop culture moment has been recreated ever since. And also the band, they just fitted the time. They were very silly and they just wanted to take the mick out of the extravagance of the era, and they did that really well, even including calling their first album Fantastic. So in the 90s, as George's solo career took off, we saw him change his image to fit the much more minimalistic 90s era, and he would often sport very classic fashions like jeans, t-shirts and jackets in kind of leather and denim. He always had very sharp looking stubble and perfectly coiffed hair. He was very, very pristine, immaculate. He looked like a very polished version of a rock star. And he also added elements to his look that are now kind of described as queer coding, as he had an influence in Western wear like cowboy hats, cowboy boots, and more fetish wear like leather, chains and studs. And he also very famously sported his, I haven't got my crosses in, his cross earring, and this was like a subtle hint to his gay male followers, you know, that you are not going to receive eternal damnation for just being who you are. And as he matured, he refined his style again, and he was always seen in very, very high quality luxury suits, ties and blazers, and he always wore this kind of monochromatic colour palette as well. So he was sleek. He described himself as meticulous and a perfectionist, and it was really nice for his young fans to have this sleek and stylish role model to emulate. And although George always appeared as this immaculate, well put together person, he actually really struggled with stardom. And that was mainly because people were so intrusive about his personal life. And that just wasn't something that George wanted to contend with. He knew that every time somebody wanted a photograph or an autograph, it's probably to sell on as memorabilia. And he just really wanted to connect with his genuine fan base. His battle to protect his reputation and also to gain control of his musical rights, it spanned his entire career, and it must have just been absolutely exhausting. And he was returning from Pride in the early hours of the 4th of July 2010 when he actually had a car accident and drove straight into the door of Snappy Snaps in Hampstead Heath. And obviously this story was a massive scandal because he was arrested for being under the influence, and he actually pleaded guilty to driving whilst unfit. He said that he was taking prescription medication, and he was sentenced to 8 weeks in prison, but he only served 4 weeks. And when he was released, he kind of changed his attitude towards appearing in the media. He decided to work with the media so he wouldn't have to face this constant harassment in the street. But George didn't let this scandal stop him from being the musician he wanted, and he actually went on a really successful tour in 2011 called Sinfonica, and he started by playing at the Prague State Opera House. But sadly, by the next year, in 2012, he had fallen severely ill with pneumococcal pneumonia, and he had to have immediate life-saving surgery as his condition was so dire. And there's some really sad footage of George once he kind of emerges from hospital and goes back to his home in London, and he has to hold a press conference, and he's clearly just so unwell, and the media are just being obtrusive, asking questions, and he's really trying to be loyal to his fans and kind of assure them that he will keep touring and this is not the end for him. But you can just see that he looks so clearly unwell. He shouldn't have been talking at that moment. And unfortunately, George actually passed away on the 25th of December 2016. And it was a cruel twist of fate, really, that he would pass on Christmas Day, because he was very, very famous for his Christmas song, Last Christmas. And this is something that British people play year upon year. It's really big part of his legacy. And I was really happy because this song got to #1 again in 2022, which I just think speaks volumes about George's legacy and his contribution to music that will last forever. So we have come to the end of this video, but I will see you again in my follow-up video when we're going to sew a red carpet outfit. Ooh. This is my cat snoring.